Welcome to today's episode of the Psychedelic Mom podcast. I'm here today with Carista Luminare, and she is a PhD who has been practicing for over 40 years, and she works with couples and individuals to heal their trauma and to help them. Gosh, Carista, you do so many things. It's so hard to describe you. I interviewed Carista back in November, and I'm bringing her back on because her expertise is unbelievable. She's one of my teachers, and I've actually worked with Carista one-on-one to do my own deep work. So I brought Carista back to share more of her wisdom. How are you today?
I'm having a good day in sunny California. Thanks.
So nice. So I wanted to dive into today some of what we were talking about on the last time I interviewed and go a little bit deeper.
Sure.
And we both work with clients. We work with them in different ways and in similar ways. And ultimately, everybody seems to be wanting to move from like their wounds to wisdom. So I thought that could be a little bit of our theme today of that process. So tell me a little bit about your work with clients, and when somebody comes to you and says, I'm suffering, I'm in pain, what's the first thing you offer them and look at?
Yes. So when I work with a client the first time, I offer something called a comprehensive assessment session. And basically that involves inviting the client to first share 2 outcomes that they want from my support, assuming we're going to go beyond that first session. And that supports them in really clarifying their priority issues. Because often people really don't know what they want, and they leave it up to the practitioner. And so when I get those 2 outcomes, a sentence or 2, I make sure I include what they want, the kind of support they want, and what they're looking for to resolve, in addition to everything else that I'm seeing popping up that they have no idea may be part of what they're trying to heal. It's a 2-hour session, so it's very comprehensive. And I always make sure that I include questions about the family of origin regarding the themes that they present, at least on the conscious level. Usually, because I'm a couples counselor, as well as those who are adults who want to heal their childhood issues, how it's impacting their self-worth, their relationships, personally and professionally. There's usually a sense of trying to understand what the origin of some of the patterns are. Beliefs, messages, adaptive strategies. And what I'm really listening for as a trauma specialist is, an attachment specialist is, where's the distress in real time? Because one can spend forever looking at family of origin. We have a whole 18 plus years just in terms of what's considered childhood, and then there's young adulthood. And all that conditioning, all those experiences actually shape who we are, what we believe, our guiding principles and values. And so both at the subconscious and conscious level. So I try to understand really where the distress is symptomatically now. And it's not always trauma. Sometimes it's just need to change, life crisis that requires, new evaluations of how the person's investing their time, energy into personal relationships. Life.
So when people come to you, what would you say are some of the top 5 outcomes that people are looking for? Or like, also, I'm feeling anxiety. What are kind of like the 5 outcomes, but what are also kind of the 5 real struggles within some self that they're coming to you for?
Well, and that one of my particular specialties services is working with couples, particularly couples in crisis. They're always wanting to understand what's up with our communication. Why does it keep recycling these vicious cycles of overwhelm, being misunderstood, not being heard, not being seen? And I can almost always find how one's early childhood attachment styles with their primary attachment figures are playing out in their present adult time relationships. And so that's one primary theme. Variations of trauma. I mean, we can talk about the different forms of trauma, traumatic behavior, traumatic symptoms, which is basically, the way I simplify that is someplace in the present life, sometimes the origins coming from past conditioning, where the person feels overwhelmed. They feel overwhelmed and or threatened by something in their outer world that's triggering a feeling of anxiety, depression, shame, feeling malaise, kind of, checked out in some way, nightmares, irritability, mood changes, either in relationship to themselves and or others. And you asked me for more. Well, again, because another one of my orientations is working with those who are trying to heal traits of codependency, traits of narcissism, that often will become kind of a qualifying lens in which we look at things, and negative self-esteem, the basics.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, and I was saying that, just even with my own clients, there seem to be some common, maybe universal wounds that keep showing up again and again.
Yeah.
Kind of the unworthiness wound, the shame,
I'm not
maybe
wanted. I'm
not
not
wanted,
lovable.
abandoned. Yes. What other ones would you say are the most common of these wounds?
I would say in relationship, the most common symptoms are feelings of feeling insecure and not safe in a partnership. Underneath that is the fear of abandonment, the fear of rejection, feeling traumatized, overwhelmed by some of the dynamics. Shame, you referenced, is really simplified by some part of the self feels I am bad. I'm a bad husband, I'm a bad wife, I'm a bad lover, I'm a bad child, I'm a bad friend. Whereas guilt is my behavior. Something in my behavior is not good. It's something in what I do has transgressed the person's sense of integrity or self-value. So, how we present is symptomatic of where to target the healing. What I'm listening for is where the most distress is, because when there's the most distressed, we're hijacked. Our awareness is hijacked in coping with usually feeling a sense of fight or flight. And when we're in that more primitive part of our brain, we're not in this part, the prefrontal lobes, where we have the ability to be in mutuality, in appreciation, in sense of safety and security. So as long as we're hijacked, whether it's a thought, we're projecting our own fears in our mind, or it's actually something outside of us, a relationship that feels threatening, a condition in life, just survival issues. As long as we're hijacked in that more primitive part of our brain of fight or flight, we can't function well because all of our rational senses are taken offline, our ability to discern what's true, what's not true, to be pro-relational, and our hearts are usually closed. And so we can't really care for ourselves and care for others. We're in a kind of a survival sense, and that's where one begins to look at if this is a chronic state that the person's in, chronic distress, chronic overwhelm versus acute, which is more of a single instant. There's kind of acute trauma, there's chronic trauma, and there's complex trauma. If we're in acute, we're in this kind of single incident, someone hit my car and I've got to resolve it. I'm okay or I'm not okay. I have to go to the hospital. Chronic is repeated and prolonged, like domestic violence or abuse, something that's constantly an onslaught of feeling threat and dangerous. It can also be mild. It can be kind of chronic neglect. Neglect is often a sign of trauma, where someone important to us, a parent, a child, a primary partner, is actually neglecting paying attention to us, and that feels threatening. It goes on and on. It's kind of low grade, and then there's high grade, like something is like a natural disaster, or a violent crime, or something like something very, very overwhelming. And then complex trauma, it's a little bit more complex. It's exposure to many kind of many kinds of traumatic events, multiple traumatic events, invasive, sometimes more personal, and there's just a lot of them. So you handle one facet of the crystal, or the of trauma, and there's a whole bunch of others. So I'm always looking for where a person's overwhelmed, because that's where they're not functioning well, and they can't be their true self.
So when people come to you and you do this assessment and you're looking for their trauma. You're probably reading their body language, all of it.
Yeah.
Are you listening for things like, I'm just going back to, again, just what I can hear a lot is, my mother was really difficult. Well, how was your mother difficult? I always had to do kind of what she said. I didn't have a voice. My father was someone who raged, or no, my house was great, but it had to be perfect. And I had to be kind of the traditional, pretty perfect, pleasing. Or there was a dynamic between my parents that I felt uncomfortable around. Are these forms of trauma?
In my particular way of working with people, you're describing what I call childhood developmental trauma. As an attachment specialist, and not so much a diagnostician who can who diagnoses using the psychiatric DSM-5,
Right.
finds traumas, any situation where one's life or bodily integrity is threatened. It's more generic. And they're more the larger traumas, assault and personality disorder and terrorist attacks and that kind of thing. What you're describing is what's called childhood developmental trauma, which is something that I have really studied quite extensively, personally and professionally. I wrote a book to prevent it called Parenting Begins Before Conception way back in 2000. My doctoral dissertation was on that subject. And it basically is saying that when we don't get seen for who we are, we don't get heard when we speak our feelings and needs, and we don't get held when we need to be soothed and self-regulated and calmed, then the child begins to adapt. They're called adaptive strategies to be able to survive this kind of neglect. Now, neglect is now considered a form of abuse in some new studies that have been coming out. Maternal and paternal or primary caregiver neglect. In other words, the child's left alone to self-regulate when they need co-regulation. They need someone to love them, to understand them. That's a two-party system, is being loved by another, understood by another, seen by another, heard by another, supported by another, held by another. All these major needs, if there's someone neglecting us. I recently read a study where they said it's equivalent to the impact of physical abuse, but it's so silent. And it gets so normalized and minimized that this is how my family system works. This is how my mother or father or primary caregiver relates to me. So I can't expect more, but it doesn't mean the psyche won't adapt to it and feel the sadness and the grief of being abandoned. The can't develop one's self-expression because they're suppressed. Raging parent, overwhelmed, so stay small and don't upset them, and just playing a certain role, be the good girl or the good boy or the rebellious child, so that I find some way to cope with not being able to just relax in my true self and be seen and heard and felt and celebrated, which is what creates healthy ego development. That's what love is. To be seen, felt, understood, loved as we are, who we are, and then guided with wisdom how to bring out our true nature, how to bring out our potential. So if we have imbalances in our personality, be it biochemical, genetic, conditioning, the loving parent, whatever gender or parents, are committed to really guide the child to create safety, security, so the child can express what it needs, and the parents are need attuned to help the child get those appropriate needs fulfilled and guide them how certain ways of self-expression are not healthy. Hitting your little brother or sister or your friend is not a good thing, but the impulse control of a young child doesn't know that. So if the parent smacks the child, threatens the child in some way to suppress their impulsivity, and the child's just experiencing an expansion, or they have a biochemical sensitivity, ADHD or something, and the child is frightened, self-suppression, it's not going to help the child learn how to use their physical expression or their verbal expression in a way they trust themselves or have confidence, because they're being frightened into submission. That's called a childhood adaptive strategy, and that's considered developmental trauma. But there's mild moderate, and severe, as you
Right.
refer to these examples. I had a raging father, bless him. He didn't rage at us. He kind of got angry at life. But from a child's point of view, it was very scary because you never know what would set him off. And so someone else who had a raging parent who went after their character nature,
Mm-hmm.
that would be more severe impact because it would affect their direct self-worth. That's
Mm-hmm.
more moderate to severe, impact of a raging parent. For me, it was kind of like walk on eggshells. At any moment dad could set off, but it's still, I felt loved by him. I didn't feel attacked directly. I was just on edge with whatever would flip him out, like not finding the car keys. And
Right.
when I was younger, I didn't really know the difference.
So your father,
Yep,
you were talking about, didn't come at you directly, but there
correct.
was this eggshell walking in the house. And I think so many people can identify with that, whether
Yeah.
it's like a mother or a father or a caregiver in the house. Tell me from your professional kind of experience, is that a big T or a small t trauma? And what's happening in a child's body when that's going on?
Okay. Well, I'll define big T, little t. It's not my distinction. It's the new kind of help the mainstream understand there actually are more significant, more mild to moderate forms of trauma, which is more the little t, and more moderate to severe forms of trauma. So examples of little t include the non-life-threatening injuries. It can include things like emotional abuse, bullying, harassment, loss of significant partner, um, death of a pet, where it's not life-threatening. Events that typically don't involve violence or
Mm-hmm.
disaster, but they create significant distress,
Mm-hmm.
overwhelm. And it's this feeling of, I can't quite get through it. It's affecting my ability to feel clear-minded and coping with life in a way that I feel confident in present time. And then the big T traumas are more the life-threatening events or situations, a natural disaster, a violent crime, school shooting, chronic kind of ongoing trauma that just overwhelms the system, repeated abuse. These are more the forms of, the big ones that just overwhelm the system to the point where it
Mm-hmm.
will shut down.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happens, there's another notion that's come out in the last decade through Peter Levine's work called somatic experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
He discovered that when the nervous system and the brain and the heart get overwhelmed, I'm going to make this very simplistic,
Mm-hmm.
the body literally can't, what I call, digest it. That's what overwhelm is. It's like, this is happening and I'm overwhelmed by it, and can't I can't face it. It feels threatening. I feel somewhat new anxiety as a result of it, new symptoms, depression, panic, and a feeling of life feels disordered. I feel more distressed than relaxed most of the time. It could be big T, little t. But the most important thing is that the body will take that on. If you think about a car accident, I use this metaphor a lot with clients. Physical car accident, you get hit. Why do some people walk out of a car that's completely mangled and they're okay? And other people have lifelong chronic physical pain with scar tissue. It's the same with emotional assaults to the psyche, to the heart, to the self-worth of a child, a young adult, or any of us at any age. We feel aggressed, assaulted, violated in a way, abused in a way, neglected in a serious way. Then those feelings that arise, they actually go in the feeling of fight or flight, and the brain gets aroused, the nervous system goes into distress. And if that can't be shaken off, it can't be released and
Mm-hmm.
processed, then it's almost always stored somewhere in the body. You think about, my neck is sore, my
Mm-hmm.
stomach's tight, I'm wound up. And for those of us who do somatic work, where we have people close their eyes and actually go into the distress that's being held in the body, and we ask, what's the emotion there? Is
Mm-hmm.
there an image there? And we find there's often this, what I call emotional scar tissue, someplace where there was impact, just like a physical accident, but it was more on the invisible emotional level. And then it's stored because it's not healed,
It's pretty
just like a
amazing.
physical accident.
Yeah. And for children, when there is that dynamic that we were just talking about, whatever it is that's causing that overwhelm, a lot of times children don't even show it. it's all kind of being internalized, isn't it?
Oh, it's an issue that's dear to my heart. That's why I wrote
Yeah.
the book I wrote, to try to prevent some of that trauma. Um, yes, children have no clue that
Mm-hmm.
when their parents don't feel safe, when they feel shamed, when they feel they're not good enough, or they need to protect themselves from their parents, if it's a scary parent, what we call traumatic bonding, feeling in danger, feeling dismissed, feeling you don't care about me,
Mm-hmm.
feeling I'm a failure, I'm not good enough, I'll take care of myself because no one's there. That's more than neglect. Those
Mm-hmm.
feelings are normalized and minimized by the child if they don't know. The problem is not with what they're feeling. The problem is that the primary attachment figure or figures have no idea how to love. They have
Mm-hmm.
no idea how to create safety and security for the child. So the child starts wiring relationship is riddled with these feelings of insecurity, sometimes trauma, sometimes danger. And so as I get older, I think that's normal. That to relate to
Mm-hmm.
someone in a two-party system includes abuse, assault, neglect, fear, insecurity, and yelling, versus what we call secure attachment. I call secure love. I'm safe. I trust you. I'm a priority for you. You're my go-to person. I can be my true self with you. That's what the child needs to thrive, and the
Mm-hmm.
adult for that matter. We never outgrow the need to be our true selves and to be loved. So in childhood, the primary traumas from a developmental,
Mm-hmm.
just affecting my self-esteem, my self-worth, is usually the absence of being held when first is born. There's also a lot
Mm-hmm.
of prenatal. I did a lot of prenatal psychology research in my dissertation. There's a lot in terms of what the child experiences in the womb if the mother's in a constant state of threat. But when we come out with the need to be held, if we're not held, then we don't feel loved. It's that simple.
Mm-hmm.
That's the language of love. And then as we start to relate and come into connecting our eyes to the face of the people that hold us, we need to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
When we start to speak out for our needs, we need to be heard. And we need to have those parts of ourselves understood, what's called need attunement. So all of these primary, and then they need to be held,
Mm-hmm.
they need to be seen. I see you, I love you, I hear you. Oh, you're crying. You need some care. You need some food. You need some to be held. You need to go to sleep. Those are the primary love languages before we speak, which doesn't really start if we're lucky to be understood at the age of 2. So if our parents aren't tuning into those ways of caring for us, that's when the developmental trauma begins to become more significant, and the scar tissue of the pain of why when I cry out no one listens. Oh well, I guess I won't have any needs. So I'm just going to be an object in this parent's
Mm-hmm.
world, be a product of what they need from me. That creates the
Mm-hmm.
codependent caretaker, the good girl, the good boy. I don't even have needs. Of course the child has needs, but I can't have them. No one's giving me a signal they care. I just have to play the role in order to get the love. So I have to do what they need. And we start to self-abandon. And then when we get in relationships later in life and we're upset with our partner that they're not loving us a certain way, and they go, what do you need? And you go, I don't know what I need. I just know this doesn't feel good and I'm mad, and
Right.
and they can't even put words to it. And then they're expecting their partner to know what they need. But they don't even know what they need.
Right.
Those are the ones that have the emotional neglect in particular.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of kids and they think it's normal because they don't know what secure love feels like. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, no, no. It's great. I'm thinking, have you met somebody in your life?
Anyone that has
Have you
secure
met
love.
anybody yet that doesn't have some form of early childhood wounding?
Not many. I mean, again, there's mild spectrum,
But
severe.
okay, so let's
There
even
are
take the
some
mild
people.
spectrum. Yeah,
Yes,
this
but
is what I'm curious about. The
well,
mild spectrum,
yeah.
because I don't know, I'm not seeing it, but the mild spectrum, is that still playing out in some way? When you say mild spectrum, what do you mean?
Well, think of someone who comes into a family where they have multiple siblings. The mother or father, whoever the caregivers are, even grandparents, basically can't pay attention to them because the parents are working, They have many mouths to feed, and not out of an absence of love for each child, but
Mm-hmm.
literally there's not enough time or energy to give each child the deep need, attunement, and intention they need.
Right.
So, each child will take on a role. Either I'll become the caregiver for the siblings, and that's my role and my needs are put aside, or I'll be the rebeller and make sure I get attention for what I need at all
Mm-hmm.
costs. Or I'll just be the quiet one and just not need anything so that I'm not in any
Mm-hmm.
trouble because my other siblings are rebeller and look how much trouble they get in. So those are all the adaptive strategies. And it can be mild, meaning, I'm getting pretty good attention, but I could use more. And it could even be a single child whose parent is constantly working and leaves them at home
Mm-hmm.
to take care of themselves at too early an age, and doesn't have other caregivers to care for them. It can come
Mm-hmm.
in endless forms. I just want to say to your question, is there anyone that's kind of unscathed by some kind of developmental trauma? In other words, they were overwhelmed in a consistent way, where they just had to adapt and suppress themselves.
Yeah,
That's
because I think that even not what we're talking about, it's not deliberate. Even the forms of parenting that have been customary through some of these generations, that
yeah,
then everything continues. It's not a lack of love, but it may be a lack of ability, strategy, awareness, capability. A mother maybe not embodied herself. So
yeah,
even the clients that come in and have some of that minor
yeah,
family stuff still seem to be affected by it.
yeah. I mean, to your question, do I know anyone? I just want to just complete that one because there is someone, we're hanging here. It's actually one of my best friends. She had two parents that really loved her,
Mm-hmm.
and she, I mean, really loved her. They were secure, attached parents. They had a great
Mm-hmm.
relationship. They loved each other. They loved her. She grew up in a middle class, probably upper middle class background, greatly educated, and didn't have serious trauma. We talk about it because she's also a
Mm-hmm.
therapist. And often she doesn't quite understand. I've had a lot of trauma. So, she doesn't have a full direct experience about the impact of trauma, how it can really overwhelm the system. But
Mm-hmm.
that woman is in joy
Mm-hmm.
most.
That's great.
And she told me the other day she wakes up happy. She's in her 70s. She wakes up happy. And even when she has, her people in her life, dear people in her life who are somewhat compromised and trouble, she has this kind of innate at her core consciousness sense of security, which allows her to feel positive
Mm-hmm.
about life. And qualities, experiences like joy and love and lightness of being and positivity, they can only happen when you feel safe and secure within
Mm-hmm.
yourself. Now, has she had traumatic experiences? Both parents have died. She had a difficult sibling. That was kind of where her growth edge was. But she is basically, riding it pretty easy this lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Do I see there are certain places where she reacts that come from early conditioning? Not much. But again, she's in
Mm-hmm.
her 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So she's an example to me of someone that really got the benefits of secure attachment. There are those who got secure attachment, but later, somewhere along the way, they were traumatized when their parents died. Sibling was aggressive and scary. Was sexually abused by a childhood babysitter. Me. Um, was bullied in school. Had nothing to do with the family system.
Mm-hmm.
There's endless ways to feel overwhelmed by life,
Mm-hmm.
some way through a particular relationship, and not knowing how to navigate it, and it just becomes I suppress my self-expression because this overwhelms me and I have to adapt so I feel less overwhelmed, which can include compartmentalizing. So
Mm-hmm.
to that degree, those who are in the minor to moderate, they might function out of their adaptive strategy, being the good girl, the perfectionist, the high achiever, the rebeller, whatever persona, helps them thrive or not. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's some incident in life that triggers the compartmentalized or suppressed trauma,
Part.
be it an acute,
Mm-hmm.
little t, big T. That suppressed part that's stored in the subconscious and often in the body
Mm-hmm.
begins to rattle. And that's why we get a lot of people in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and on up, 70s, 80s, especially those who are older, where they coped, they created an
Mm-hmm.
entire life strategy to be successful, But those very primitive parts, the fear of death starts triggering things, the body elements, the sense of memory loss, and even with those in the mid-range, the 30s, 40s, 50s, some they get in a relationship that mimics their relationship trauma with a family member, and those parts are up to be addressed. How do we know? We know we need attention. We know we need professional attention because our reactions are disproportionate to what's happening in real time. That's often a sign of trauma. Like when couples are in these vicious cycles and they go over and over, often one or both are playing out some kind of relational trauma. Or, we get in my childhood memory of sexual abuse from a childhood babysitter happened in my early 30s, triggered by an event in my life through a relationship, and actually really triggered by a particular movie. So, and it was in there for 30 years,
Yeah,
and
that's
then
interesting. I was actually going to ask you that because it does seem like there's this arc, maybe never ending, to
yeah,
healing
yeah,
and awakening and wholeness. And one is first having the awareness of the trauma.
yeah.
And so I was wondering for you, clients that come to you, how some of that awareness came, because it seems like what I'm seeing is either some spiritual awakening, maybe it was the use of an earth medicine that shined the light on something that was outside of their conscious awareness,
You can do it.
suffering or pain. But here you're talking about a movie brought it up. I had a friend recently say she was out on a run and boom, got hit by something she didn't know. So is that true that it can kind of come up at any time and anything can kind of be the spark for
Trigger.
witnessing the trigger? Yeah. Okay.
Triggers. Yeah, and then the psyche, if it feels overwhelmed and it doesn't have safe conditions, be it a practitioner to help them or some girl or boyfriend to talk about or a journal or whatever it is, if it's so hardwired neurologically to store it somewhere in the body,
Mm-hmm.
then it'll just go back in. And now
Mm-hmm.
that pain might begin to gnaw at the psyche, at the body. And that's where sometimes, not always, we start to see the origins of addictions are often these suppressed parts of the self that are in pain, the emotional, painful scar tissue that overwhelms the system, be it the dynamic ones in college, high school, a marriage, partnership, will start to mimic some of those feelings
Mm-hmm.
and that we had earlier or we had in another traumatic relationship, even in adulthood or in something really, overwhelming. And we'll begin to, those feelings will begin to rattle. And sometimes people will medicate the pain
Mm-hmm.
from money addiction to food to drugs to, sex addiction. And what is the addiction? Using something that's harmful to the self too much to medicate the pain. So that's why in addiction recovery, why, if for those lucky who can afford a residential, part of the thought is that put yourself in a concentrated container where
Mm-hmm.
all the distractions of life that you normally use, including the addictive substance, is not before you, and those suppressed feelings are going to come up, and you're going to be in a concentrated container, because if someone's in severe addiction, there's usually complex trauma going on there, or some very deep acute trauma. Usually, not always. Sometimes it's biochemical, could be other things.
Mm-hmm.
But it's often triggered by some overwhelming part of the system. That was a
Hmm.
kind of whole bunch of thoughts in one.
I had this experience the other night. You and I talked about it a little bit when I was like in bed and I was kind of in meditation, but just kind of lying there. And it was almost like I saw this building come out of the ground. And the building was like, oh, wow. I think Eckhart Tolle calls it the pain body. There's other names for it, shadow. But all of a sudden, I had this like separation in my mind of the egoic constructed self that came out of my conditioning and my family dynamic. It was so interesting to suddenly like step away from it and think, oh, that's been running a lot of stuff in my life kind of unconsciously, like
Yeah.
the way I respond to things or just even career path, all of it. How much of people's early conditioning is playing out in their lives unconsciously, would you say?
Depends on the person.
Yeah.
In general, a lot, unless one has done a lot of work on themselves and or they didn't have a dominant experience of self-suppression, however that happened, to be their true self, however you want to define it, but that's the ability to kind of be in one's natural potential, unfolding, age-appropriate, feeling free to express one's feelings and thoughts with discernment and wisdom, feeling loved, self-love, primarily surrounded by those who love them, and having the capacity to not invest in those that don't. And
Yeah.
and so we're all playing out some of this conditioning you refer to in different ways, and a lot of it depends on the kind of help we get. I started very young, and I'm 67. I started when I was 18, and I've had a lot of complex trauma and physical trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. I had two parents that really, really loved me, but didn't know how to love me. So I had some kind of what I call covert childhood mental health trauma. They wanted to give me the best. They were loving people, but they had some, traits, narcissistic traits, and kind of control patterns out of their conditioning. So I had a lot of things to clear there. Just depends on the person, Michaela. And
Yeah.
some people, they don't need to dig deep. I don't know many people who wouldn't benefit from some,
Yeah.
A year or two worth of therapy, counseling of some sort, self-development, just to see if kind of the identity they're living in and the role they're playing in life and what they're doing feels authentic,
Right.
feels like who they are and what they want to be living.
It's interesting. My mother's been here for a little bit, and
Yeah.
so she was staying with me for a while, and she's been listening to my podcast and listening to some of these conversations. And so she walked in the other day when we were having coffee, and she said, "Wow, everything's been a construct. Like, I've just been living the construct." And I was like, "Yeah, I think so, possibly." And, what you were just talking about, again, my mother is very loving and nurturing.
Yeah.
And there was in her generation a suppression of more women's voices. So it's just what she was used to. She was used to being the one who tiptoed. And so in some
Right.
ways, that's what I learned. So it wasn't, overt, suppression of my voice. It was kind of the covert, this is how we do it. And so, yeah, just
Right.
that was
I
kind
mean,
of the building of looking at, oh, look at all the ways that one little thing has played out.
right. I mean, constructs often referred to as beliefs, values that were given. There's social ones like my parents, grandparents were conditioned under the Victorian era. Children are to be seen and not heard. Well, there's all the, can't be heard, can't be understood, can't have a voice. I just have to be an object in your world, and I can't be angry with you. I can't be hurt by life. I can't, I just have to be silent. That's our grandparents and our great grandparents. That's in Western culture, very much the Victorian era. And so how much of that was dismantled in any particular branch of the family tree? In certain cultures, we wear emotions on sleeves, and other ones it's stoic and suppressed just by the religious cultures. So what matters is for each person to assess, do I feel free? Do I know who I am as a good being? Do I know kind of what my guiding values and beliefs are that empower me to be authentic, true to myself? I mean, those are kind of the buzzwords. Do I feel peace of mind most of the time, or do I feel distressed and overwhelmed and I can't cope with life? Well, if you feel like overwhelmed and you can't cope with life, get some help if you can't resolve it yourself, because you don't have to live that way. Whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
Trauma, not trauma, just overwhelmed. Living in a relationship where one feels threatened as the dominant feeling is a real red flag for me. Because there's no way you can relax or rest in yourself if you don't feel safe and secure the dominant period of time. Do we all fight with each other and get naggy? I'm not talking about kind of normal behavioral, we all have moods, but it's when you actually feel you're not safe to relax and rest and feel you don't have to walk on eggshells, and you can just be spontaneous in your self-expression and be delighted in and be honored and cherished and valued. If you don't feel that as your primary dominant experience, then get some help. I mean, there's so many amazing
Yeah.
people, qualified people, and there's some unqualified people also. As with every profession, doctors, teachers, lawyers, any level of occupation, there's qualified people and unqualified people. There's a lot of people who say they're trauma-based in coaching, or early people or people who are early sitting in medicine work, where I feel like, you have to really feel you're qualified. And when you feel you're not, if someone comes to you, and even me, 47 years later, I just told someone it's not, suicide ideation is not my specialty. Complex addictions is not my specialty. And then, giving them a referral, because you can't be good at everything, even if you're highly trained in one or more areas, or even if you're learning, you have to be able to try, but you want to just be honest at the level you can handle something. And trauma, sometimes, once you lift the lid, if it's complex trauma, and if one hasn't been trained to deal with complex trauma or understand it, to just know your limits and refer out or get supervision.
So now what would be, someone comes to you and they're feeling some of this, and you know that there's some early child wounding. So now we've established that. We know that there is some wounding. Maybe there's some shame, some unworthiness, some of those core wounds. Yeah. What do you do? How do you help somebody identify them and then heal them, to then move into this place of secure first attachment with themselves and secure love in themselves, and then out into the world? What's your process?
Well, I'm going to talk generically about myself and then kind of try to make it more general for whomever. Because I work in a particular way. I have a very keen intuition that I can often see and hear the trauma that's not being spoken. So people have their narrative about things, and underneath I'm looking at the pattern, or I'm watching the nonverbals that are showing me a mismatch with what's being said, where someone's minimizing something, but I see extreme distress going on. So I'm always wanting to go at the deepest level, and I have ways to ask questions to get the data of, again, working with their outcomes, and then, tell me about this. For example, a new client, I'm just thinking off the top of my mind this week, was talking about an eating disorder and other things that are in my wheelhouse, relationship dynamics, and has worked for decades, but never worked on the mother wound in her whole life. The mother was completely suppressive. That's all nourishment, nurturing, obese. And I could see and hear the origin of so much of the conditioning, and how she would use food along the way through all these periods of neglect where her father died and blah, blah, blah. So, what I'm looking for, I have a way to, I can't, it's very holistic and nonlinear. I'm listening for the distress, and I'm listening for as early back as I can get where it first began. Now, some people do only want to talk, and you can get a lot in talking. My preferred way for those who trust me is to do, in addition to talk, always an option, what I call inner work, where I have them close their eyes, parts work, and I actually have them, okay, now once I have this data and this understanding, and I'll keep getting more as you work with me over time, if you do. Some people work short term, some people medium, long term, depending. But at some point they feel safe only if they feel safe, because if they don't, just keep talking. Close your eyes, and let's, now that you've talked about this and we've spotlighted this dynamic, just close your eyes, and where in your and a little relaxation, they're fully awake the whole time. Where in your body are you feeling that? In my heart, it's so tight. Describe it. It's so heavy. Is there a feeling? I just feel grief. Okay, let's let that that part of yourself. I see I see an image that looks like me as a 3-year-old, and I'm just crying in the corner. Okay, now we've spotlit kind of this cluster of feelings at a young age, most likely. We just go with what's coming up, and I say, give that part the mic. There's let it talk from its point of view.
Mm-hmm.
You, the conscious self, looking at the 3-year-old and grieving in your imagination, in your feeling body, can talk about it. If we can get it to talk about what it's grieving about, we're going to get a whole bunch of information.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's called somatic work, finding it in the body, letting it come up as an image, feeling, words, let it talk. And then I hear what its beliefs and position and what happened to it. And then I reparent it.
Mm-hmm.
As an attachment specialist, knowing what insecure and secure love is, I actually give it a new way of looking at itself. So let's say it had a shame-based, both parents, if it had 2 parents, guilt, suppression, narcissistic parents that didn't care for their feelings, or one or both. And it just feels so little. This part feels so little. I can't have a voice. It's scary. If I do, I'm just going to get in trouble. And then, I'm not lovable, because if my parents love me, they wouldn't leave me alone and they wouldn't scare me like that. So we find out what the child was feeling. We're actually back, not necessarily at the exact incident, although sometimes we get exact incidents. We're kind of at the, just like, like in a car accident, my leg's broken, it's hurting. I don't quite know everything about it, but I know it's broken. I know my scar tissue, I've got scar tissue on my arm or in my organ. So we're getting right there. We're letting that part talk. And then I really look at what it needs to feel safe and secure. And often one of my major pattern interventions is to the child. The child always thinks there's something wrong with them when they don't get the love, especially if they've been told something's wrong or bad about their needs or feelings or selfhood. So one of the biggest interventions I find is useful is re-educating, reparenting that part directly by saying, the problem wasn't you, that you're unlovable. The problem is that your parent didn't know how to love. Suddenly this belief that the problem was with me, there's something about me, something that simple and suggestive, can help the child. Oh my God, I now see the parent, because of their wounding, not to blame or bash them, but just to realize. And then the next part of it is recovering those lost parts of selfhood and those feelings of being unlovable, and giving very practical education to the psyche and to that part of the self, as helping it grow up, as well as replacing belief systems. And as a practitioner, doing my authentic best to actually let that part of the self, at whatever age it's appearing, even up to time, realize those needs of being heard, the need of being understood, the development to be seen. I see you were frightened. That matters. That must have been scary. I hear you, that there was no one there for you. I understand that left you feeling you can't trust anyone. Let me hold you energetically. Let me hold those feelings, and love you, just even impersonally, just have compassion, empathy. Like, it's safe for you to reveal this part of yourself. And that in itself is healing, because that part never had a voice.
Right.
So those are ways, practically, I work with people, and that partners can work with each other, or, I just like, let me go to you and just tell you, I'm just frightened right now. I'm afraid my boss is going to fire me. He reminds me of my dad, who just scared the bejeebies out of me. And I just feel like a little girl, and unless I can tell him how, or her, how oppressive they are, I can't work here, but I'm afraid because I need the money. And, and we're holding each other through these complex nuances. I've been heard. Now I know why I'm so overwhelmed and not sleeping. Now let's look at solutions. What can we do about it? Get some coaching, get a mediator, leave the job, get some therapy, come up with your own solution, write the email, go to human relations, human resources, So then you look, you know what the distress is, and then what are the practical steps? And that's all custom designed.
Right.
To the minute.
So, oh gosh, so much here. The inner work, going into the deep subconscious, using the body, then the reparenting. First, you're finding out the core beliefs and what the wound is and what the need was that wasn't met, and then reparenting. I've also noticed with some of your work that also, besides giving that child the space to say what it needed, it's also like full expression. whether it never got the chance to yell at a parent or to express or move, almost like metabolize
Yep,
all of the emotion that was never felt, creating the space for that as well.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that is what Peter Levine of Somatic experiencing calls shaking out the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It's a notorious example that he learned how the brain works with animals that he applied to humans, which we now know works, is what he calls shaking off, where the saber-toothed tiger out in the jungle or out in the plains, attacks, sees an antelope. The antelope knows it can't escape. It can't go
Mm-hmm.
into fight. It can't fight the saber-toothed tiger. It'll be annihilated. It
Right.
can't flight because it'll
Mm-hmm.
be chased and annihilated. So it has this automatic survival strategy to what's called freeze and fold, just collapse as if
Yeah.
it's dead, so that the tiger will lose interest. And the tiger is going towards this freezer fold, the antelope's alive, and suddenly another, hyena's out there, and the lion suddenly goes, I want that instead. And the tiger's attention's off the antelope.
Mm-hmm.
The antelope's safe again. It will get up and
Mm-hmm.
literally shake
Shake.
out. You see a
Yep.
dog do that sometimes. It'll just
Shake
shake
it.
out after a bath or something. And it shakes that trauma, all that freeze and fold and
Yep.
all that suppression, literally in real time. And then it's back to real time. It's present.
Right.
And it doesn't hold the trauma until the next attack and next assault. So he applied this 30 years ago in his book,
Wild.
Waking the Tiger, I think,
Mm-hmm. Waking the tiger. Yeah.
all his work. And, it's held in the body. And he developed this whole body of work. And so this shaking out is what we're trying to do, either verbally,
Mm-hmm.
energetically. And so if, let's say, myself, I was also physically assaulted, that when I relived that trauma to try to shake out where I freeze and fold and got really harmed, that my initial trauma sessions were actually going back to the incident and finding the voice to tell that person, no,
Right.
the place where I didn't finish the shake out.
Right.
You can't. And I actually found the personal power in my imagination,
Right.
but it was going through my nervous system to,
Even push.
protect myself and throw them off.
Yes.
And I had to relive it many times. And sometimes you only have to relive it once. Or,
Mm-hmm.
with a suppressive parent, when you're in therapy and you're going, they scared me. It's like, it's safe
Mm-hmm.
now to tell them what you never got to say. That's one I often use, you know. How dare you? You're da-da-da, and that's
Mm-hmm.
called building agency. Suddenly having the voice, all that suppressed, like a genie in a bottle, all that suppressed fear, especially if it's been chronic, starts to defrost. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I
And it
can come up.
holds like significant life force.
It's suppressed life force that's been compartmentalized suddenly goes, I have a chance, and it becomes
Mm-hmm.
timeless. It can be things that you
Mm-hmm.
experience. I mean, many of us, have prenatal memories when we can create certain circumstances. You can actually start to begin. How do you know you're on to something real? Because you're actually feeling the sensations in your body. You can't mock up
No.
distress. You can't mock up rage. You go with the authentic feeling, what's live in the moment, that
Mm-hmm.
in real time feels connected to the past. And you know what? We found that even if the details aren't literal
Mm-hmm.
in what happened, if there's charge, if there's emotional distress in the system, whatever helps you shake it out, that part of your life force will begin to return, sometimes fully and sometimes over time, because it can have complex parts that kind of like a knot.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a knot. But more complex trauma takes a series of sessions with a good practitioner. And, the more acute or simple ones that are just single event related are much easier. You relive them and you start to shake them out. And you begin to come those primitive parts of yourself that never got to grow up, that finally have a voice. You begin to have what's called this agency of self-worth. I'm free to express myself. I don't have to fear being the backlash
Mm-hmm.
of the person that scared me because I'm in my imagination. It's not happening real time, so I can say anything I want. That's another
Right.
thing is they're dead. You can
Right.
say anything you want, or they're out of your life. That place where you never finish what you need to say or feel. Now's the time in the safety of the session.
When I do this work with clients, sometimes they are shocked kind of when they open their eyes. It's like they'll get a 3-year-old part that they haven't known about forever.
Right?
And they go into these deep places. I think they're always surprised that it's right there in the body. It's right there. It's
It's
pretty
amazing.
wild.
I agree with you. When I have people close their eyes, some have
Mm-hmm.
trepidation, but once they realize that way of working, they feel so much better because all that suppressed energy starts to move, and they get new ways to reframe and feel
Mm-hmm.
about what happened. But to get them there, if they've never experienced it, the common resistance, which I always honor, you can only
Yes.
meet them at the level they feel safe. So some people have to
Mm-hmm.
go very slow if they're willing to try. The greatest fear I find is I'm afraid if I open up this Pandora's box or I open up the dam, it's just going to flood me and I'm going to be back in the trauma,
Yep.
overwhelmed with it, like I know I've been living subconsciously, and I'm never going to escape the dark feelings. And
Yes.
that's a very common adaptive strategy because back then it wasn't safe. There was no one. You couldn't say, help, I need help. I'm afraid. I'm going to need support. So if you had a parent that you were lucky and you were less apt to store and
Mm-hmm.
those
And
experiences.
viscerally, a lot of times, the feeling feels so real. Like sometimes the heat in the body, the sense
Pain.
of whether it's shame or pain, whatever it is live in the moment. And that's the reminder of this is past, this is memory. But it is pretty wild how it's stored in a way that is like right there, real.
That's right. It's
Yeah.
past, it's memory, but it's in real time. That memory is coming up in real
Mm-hmm.
time. And people go, how do I know I'm not making this up? Especially sexual abuse is a
Mm-hmm.
very common one. And if it's been someone that they trust or to trust, is so difficult to call them the
Yes.
perpetrator when it's your parent or sibling or someone
Mm-hmm.
close to you. And if a child's been victimized, 1 out of 4 now are victimized with sexual abuse, and
It's
that's reported.
crazy. So
And
crazy.
so, when we help, and I've had sexual abuse in my history, unfortunately more
Mm-hmm.
than once, luckily not by a family member. Those feelings, how do I know it's not false memory syndrome, which can happen,
Mm-hmm.
especially if the practitioner is feeding their own narrative, or
Right.
just the mind stores it energetically, but not literally because it was so traumatic, or their brain wasn't developed, or all kinds of things. So what I've always found, having healed my own multiple
Mm-hmm.
trauma dynamics, the memories are there, but the charge is not there. So back to why I brought that up.
Yep.
How do you know it's pretty good to trust this happened to you? Some part of it, maybe the detail's different. If you actually feel the charge of feeling overwhelmed, if you feel like in your genitals as you're reliving
Mm-hmm.
flashbacks, you're feeling
Pressure.
sensations in your
Yeah.
genitals, suppressed energy opening.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can think I was sexually abused, whatever, like there's nothing going on here. But when
Right.
you're in that memory and you feel your body, you can actually feel the sensations tightening, or you're in a sex act and you're disassociating, or you're
Mm-hmm.
watching a movie with abuse and you suddenly feel like, whoa, I'm in a trance and it feels bigger than just being overwhelmed with this horror of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
You have to begin to wonder,
Mm-hmm.
where's that coming from?
Right. Yeah. This is where it gets into, well, a couple places. You now go in and you reparent these parts. You release this kind of energy that's been stored up,
Suppressed adaptive
suppressed.
strategy.
Yep. And so,
Yeah.
how do you move from these wounds to wisdom? How do you then take that part of yourself that has been suppressed and learn the new tools? Because a lot of times you haven't self actualized, you haven't individuated, or you have communication skills that are now lacking. And when you're in an argument, you're still not quite sure, am I in the present moment or am I dragging my entire wound history with me in this moment? So what's next after the reclaiming and the reparenting and getting into the somatics, would you say?
Well, focusing on, so if I'm not that conditioned self, I'm not that
Mm-hmm.
wounded child, and I'm starting to recover, who am I really? That's what
Mm-hmm.
I call the true self discovery or recovery program,
Mm-hmm.
where one begins to get be more intentional, noticing their limiting beliefs and replacing them, noticing their negative self-worth, and working on where, if when hears oneself saying, I'm a jerk. I mean, that's a sign that you're not really in
Mm-hmm.
self-love and self-value. So where those self-identities, I am a, that are negating, to stop them and replace them. I mean, the whole
Mm-hmm.
process of recovering the true self from the
Mm-hmm.
conditioning adaptive child, or some people call it the maladaptive parts, adapted in, a way that was inauthentic. It's so holistic. It's so multifaceted. It just depends. The intervention can be in the mind, in the beliefs. It can be in the heart, one's emotional intelligence or lack of being able to know their needs or feelings. It can be in developmental trauma. It can be in playing out in adult relationship dynamics between parent and child. But if I were to go generic, I really simplify it by saying, when you feel something is overwhelming you that feels it needs attention because it keeps you from feeling at peace. You can be generally in a relaxed place. It doesn't mean the geopolitical climate anxiety isn't there or whatever, but just kind of in your day-to-day sense of yourself. The first step is awareness. In other words, get yourself educated, like we're doing now. That's the wisdom. There's small t, big T. There's developmental trauma. There's, what are examples of which big T, little t? What's this attachment approach? Am I an insecure attachment, insecure anxious, insecure avoidant? Is this just normal kind of developmental experiences? That's not really traumatic. Is the PTSD, is it not PTSD? It's something, another disorder, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Could it be generalized anxiety disorder? Could it be dissociative disorder? Could it be adjustment disorder? Could it be panic disorder? Maybe I need to get some psychiatric evaluation. Maybe I need to get some somatic experiencing. So which of the approaches feels like I want to hone in step 1, step 2, step 3, and then after awareness is building new capacity, is actually changing the old behavior to new behavior. Endless ways and techniques to find an educational program online. There's plenty of free ones, free seminars, teleseminars on trauma summits where you can learn. Find a practitioner. You can Google practitioners. You can ask friends. If you feel like you have complex, chronic dynamics, particularly in childhood, someone who specializes in that, who really has seasoned experience, there's a lot of people out there.
I also think the somatics and the internal family systems are really besides psychedelics at times can open to see, but the modalities that go along with that of the internal family systems and somatics are unbelievable. One of the other things I notice sometimes too is a pointer. It seems like our lives are an outpicturing to the interior world. So often when I'm talking to a client, if they're just telling me about their present day relationships, their job, I start to be able to piece together before they even talk about their childhood, kind of the outpicturing. I'm not feeling connected to my friends. My husband and I are having these dynamics. I'm not feeling seen at work. It's so interesting how we, in some ways, unconsciously create the very dynamics in our adult lives that will bring up the discomfort to actually have us look and heal those exiled parts and woundings. It's fascinating. It's it's fascinating how that happens.
Well, the outer life is reflecting some of the inner life. And then it often takes a crisis for most of us to get help because we have busy lives. And who wants to go in there and feel that stuff if you don't need to, even if it's well compartmentalized and being, medicated in any number of ways, or just,
it's like the very thing we've been avoiding our whole lives. Who wants to go in?
What we're avoiding is recovering our true selves.
Yes.
We're actually leaving ourselves in the wounded state. So we're only half functioning, either with ourselves or in our primary relationships or our professional relationships. I do want to cover one thing. You reminded me in that, your particular orientation is towards plant medicine, psychedelics, that I'm very pro plant medicine, and many of the Ivy League schools have studies right under their own roof where they're experimenting and finding great results. And we know with ketamine and mushrooms and LSD that in the right conditions can address depression and anxiety, and there's studies to show it. I'm 67, so many of us who could legally experiment back in the day before some of these things were legal
and work with it.
That I am noticing, especially those younger who are working with ayahuasca, and are green, that new, in other words, unseasoned, that they can have, amazing personal awakenings, and they can also re-traumatize the trauma.
Totally. I think they can be very re-traumatizing if it's not held in a safe container.
With a qualified person.
And I also see, let's say there is trauma.
Yeah.
And someone keeps going back into maybe mushrooms, right? That keeps taking them to the same, whatever medicine it is, and reliving it and reliving it. Sometimes it is maybe even adjusting. Is it MDMA that's needed or no medicine and a lot of integration? So it can be re-traumatizing and untethering, I think. You have to be so careful about who you go to.
The practitioner has to have that sensitivity, amounts matter, how often matters, and the integration of what's brought up. If the person who serves the medicine doesn't know how to integrate a particular trauma or something complex comes up, to have a referral base of qualified people to send them to, because that's usually, I'm sent people who are trying to integrate, and they are trying to integrate in a way they feel overwhelmed by what was stimulated. And don't go back in and re-inflame until that's been integrated, or if you feel like you're working with someone where that's part of it, like ketamine is often serial, or someone who's trained to work serially and integrate and stimulate, integrate, and you're in that healthy container, then that's a different.
One thing I've noticed, and I'm curious about this, and then you have to remind me, I want to go back to the other thing you said about limiting the ability of true self if you don't do this work. So remind me, I want to go back to that. But one of the things that I'm noticing, and again, I don't know if this sounds woo-woo, but in the past 6 months, even 8 months, it seems like, it was Einstein that said, you can't fix a problem with the same level of consciousness that created the problem. And our consciousness can kind of be a window of a portal about this big of what we can see. It's so interesting. And even friends who have been on the psychedelic earth medicine path for a while, they're like, God, it seems like less medicine is even needed. That maybe there's been some kind of shift on the planet where, even though we're seeing all the shadow, so much shadow arise, that this bigger portal of awareness is opening up to allow some of that to come to the surface. Because I'm noticing, even working with a client, taking them in, it's like this awareness has shifted where it might have taken medicine before, but the child part is right there. Or awareness. Are you noticing anything like this?
You're saying without using plant
medicine, just there seems to be a shift going on. Yes,
clients to deal with trauma, and I myself don't need it to access it. I trust it more right now when it's not, because I don't know if there's some inflammation happening with the medicine, although I know there's phenomenal work done with plant medicine that you can't get to.
Right.
It's the subconscious, so it's and both. I call it. There's benefit in all. There's gifts and benefit in all these paths, and there's also limits.
Yes.
That said, I'm 67, so the inner child, when I was in my 20s as a budding counselor healer, that was very new. And those of us who have been doing that work, we can access this because we've been doing it for 40 years. But it's been, inner child is in mainstream media.
Yes.
Being aware, being in the present. Oh, I saw something last night. I couldn't believe it, a reality TV show I watched. And they were all talking about being in the present with each other as a couple's one. I was like, have your feet on the ground. I'm like, whoa, this is the early stuff that we used to when Eckhart Tolle came out with Be Here Now. So
body
esoteric.
Awareness.
True Self.
Right.
I have TrueSelf.net. It was so esoteric. I used to use Holistic Health. So esoteric. I said that in my other, and now it's just, so how much of it is the paradigms, the constructs that kids are being brought up with, healthy foods, mindfulness, spirituality,
yoga,
being true to yourself is everywhere
now.
When I used to say that back in the 80s and 90s, when I first branded my stuff, Embody Your True Self, even before the internet where I got True Self, it was like, true self? What does that mean? Then authentic came out,
right?
And now everyone knows what it is. So I don't know how much is just the collective awareness that children are born into, and certainly Generation Z and millennials. I mean, they have a lot of, I can't even use the word hip. I'm not allowed to, but I have a 27-year-old daughter and my nieces and nephews. But, they're brought into mindfulness is taught in many elementary school programs and um, training the mind, training the body, yoga. So I
Amazing,
think a
though,
lot.
because one of the
Yeah.
things you were talking about, though, in some ways, to get to that true self
Yeah.
and to higher levels of awakening and realization, that shadow work needs to be cleared.
Yeah. And that shadow work, it's not done till it's done.
No.
I should
And
trademark
it can
that
go
or something.
very
I go
deep.
someday. I mean, decades working my father wound,
Yeah.
and I'm done. Peace with him, I'm done. And then the next partner would, you know, shake some of that, still the remnants of, I call it the remnants, not all done. Be like, and then one day I said, this stuff ain't done till it's done, and it'll still at 67. It's like, it's just kind of the theme of mastery out of this conditioned pattern is a lifelong path to be your true self. Just when you think you're there, you learn the next day, hey, what was true yesterday, now that I'm aware of something different, isn't true today. So the true self it's not a static state. It's
No.
awareness of discerning what feels true to self, which is unique to each person. What's true to me doesn't have to be true to you. That's why we have so much conflict. People's realities, we can't find shared realities, but it's really for oneself. It's like, this brings out who I am and who I want to be. I like to look at the true self as really more our virtuous nature, our capacity to be loving and wise and caring. And
Well, it's interesting because I've noticed in my own process, healing some of the shadow and going into this deep work, you do by nature become more virtuous, because you're not living out some
reactivity.
conditioned self that you're either trying to stay safe or you're do something for some need that's not being met. Suddenly you're coming into that deep soul self, and it's like, I don't know, the virtues seem to be more present or more available even, or I don't really know what the word is.
Well, you're maturing out of the reactivity into responding with more self-love, more compassion, more patience, more truth, more integrity. My particular work with Parenting Begins Before Conception, it was my original work back in the day, my different degrees, is to try to support the true nature, the noble nature of the child as soon as it's conceived, and certainly once it's born, so that it can be true to itself, which means I, as parent, aren't looking at the child as an extension of myself, but I, as parent, am caretaking to be need attuned to what this child needs to be, to have positive self-esteem and whatever their interests and excitements and thrills and how they want to be celebrated in healthy, empowering ways. I'm not going to place an agenda on them. I have the criteria of keeping them safe and secure, but to be empowered, to be different than me is actually a good sign. When the child, doesn't mean the child can't take on the values and virtues and tastes and desires that they like, that the parents offer them, but they have a choice.
Right.
And they have a choice. And if the child doesn't get the choice to differentiate, then the true self never gets to develop.
Well, it's amazing that you were doing this work so long ago. Maybe that work that you did back then, it seeps into the unconscious and seeps into our culture, because you were really a pioneer in all of this work.
A lot of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of pioneers too.
Yeah.
And the internet, certainly, thank you for that. And, I had my mentors, and the notions were definitely esoteric, and I would put them in my marketing material, and it would just be like, people couldn't connect. So that's how I knew. Constantly find practical ways to discuss things that to me seemed normal. Describing, but now I'm so happy to see that it's just mainstream, in there and easily Googled, and many people who are doing their own versions of awakening people. Many paths to the one, as the Sufis say.
Yep. It almost seems like there's kind of the universal wounds, and then there's the universal one way, and there's many paths to that true nature.
There is a one way,
Yeah.
which is that we're either harming ourselves or healing and empowering ourselves. We're either harming others or healing and empowering them. We're either loving ourselves or we're not. I mean, we can be in the process of either loving or we're not. But love, we talked about it in the first talk, there's wisdom to know how to love. And each person has the common theme, different love languages. But when one threatens another person's well-being or their own, those are the red flags to change behavior.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Being here.
Thank you. It's a delight always communing with you.
You too.
Whatever's popping up in our words, we seem to play together very graciously. I appreciate you.
And I will put all your information in the show notes of how people can reach you and get in touch with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for all your wisdom and for all your work with me personally.
Thank you for all your wisdom. You have a grand treasure chest yourself, and I appreciate your questions. They reflect just your wise self. So
thank you.